Hello, and welcome to this special video podcast recorded to mark the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, which is held every year on the 17th of October, that is today. My name is Prachi Kheda, and I work as an advisor on the Beyond Growth initiative, supporting the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Olivier De Schutter. To quickly introduce you, Olivier has served in this role as the UN's independent expert on poverty since 2020, before which he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food from 2008 to 2014, and a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights between 2015 and 2020. Olivier, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Prachi.
Olivier, before we get into our conversation today, could you tell us a little bit more about the role of the UN Special Rapporteur and how it relates to the broader UN system?
Right. Well, special rapporteurs are independent experts. As you said, they are appointed by the Human Rights Council, which is composed of 47 governments elected by the General Assembly of the UN. So it's a representative sample of the international community, if you wish. And our role is to provide governments with recommendations on the topic which we have a mandate to explore. I do this by providing governments with thematic reports presented to the General Assembly and to the Human Rights Council, respectively in New York and Geneva. And we also do country visits that are very important because they allow us to speak with people in poverty, to understand the concerns of those on the front line of the fight against poverty. And we can therefore provide governments with a reality check, allowing us to assess what works and what does not work as they try to combat poverty. That's my role.
So, Olivier, today we're talking about what it really means to fight poverty in a world where many of the old answers that have been told to us, such as just grow the economy, aren't working anymore. And you've spent the past 6 years as the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, challenging some deeply held assumptions about development. In particular, you've argued that moving to a post-growth world is urgent, necessary, and pragmatic. And therefore, in this conversation, we'll talk about what comes after growth, who gets to decide, and how we build a more just global economy and society. I'm very excited to dive into this conversation with you. And I want to ask you, first and foremost, what made you question this story of economic growth not uplifting billions of people out of extreme poverty in recent decades, as is often told to us? What has made you question this story and not stick with what seems to, as is argued, have worked for many years now?
Well, indeed, there is if you wish, a classic approach to combating poverty, which is based on a three-step sequence. You grow the economy, you tax households and corporations, and then you redistribute the revenue that you have been able to mobilize by financing public services and social protection. And that way of combating poverty faces two major limitations. The first one is that it's a post hoc compensatory approach to combating poverty, when in fact we also should work on measures that create an inclusive economy, in market measures, if you wish, to make sure markets work for everyone. And then we need also to put much more effort into pre-market measures, early childhood education and care, better housing conditions, better nutrition, better healthcare, in order to approach the structural causes of poverty ex ante rather than ex post. So the first limitation of the classic approach to combating poverty is that it is compensatory rather than preventative, and that it operates post-market rather than in-market and pre-market. The second limitation is that it depends on growth. And growth, we are told by scientists, cannot infinitely continue. The ecosystems cannot infinitely provide us with the resources we need to grow the economy. They are unable to absorb all the waste and pollution we cause by growing the economy. And moreover, that obsession to create growth as a precondition for combating poverty leads us to pursue policies that can be, in fact, counterproductive, leading to the very social exclusion that growth was meant to reduce. particularly leading to increasing inequalities that we've seen in countries over the past 40 years, largely as a result of the quest for growth on which we depend.
And so you've linked economic growth not just to inequality, but also to what you call a burnout economy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, indeed, one of the striking findings that we made in recent years is that while economies grow, while affluence increases in societies, depression and anxiety, burnout, also increases. And that is to be explained by the fact that when an economy grows, but when this goes hand in hand with growing inequalities, people are anxious that they may fall behind, that they may not enjoy the general progress and remain, if you wish, able to comply with the evolving social expectations. And anxiety increases as the gap between the rich and the poor continues to increase. People suffer from social anxiety, from the loss of falling, of the fear of falling behind. And that is at the heart of the mental health problems we have been seeing, particularly in rich countries. What's really striking is that these high rates of depression and anxiety become higher as a society becomes richer, not lower. So we are growing the economy, perhaps, but at the same time making people sick and creating many psychosocial risks at work and many real epidemics of burnout as a result of this quest for competitiveness and productivity.
So is the problem, as you articulate, that not just that the benefits of growth are unevenly shared, but also that growth itself produces this kind of exhaustion and insecurity?
Well, indeed, I think the heart of the problem is that we pursue growth through policies that, in fact, increase inequalities and create economic insecurity. For example, in order to stimulate growth, we flexibilize labor markets, dismantling the protections that wage workers were traditionally expected to enjoy. We have pursued growth by liberalizing trade, exposing whole sectors of the economy to unfair foreign competition and creating, again, economic insecurity for the workers in those sectors. We've pursued growth by creating a business-friendly investment climate, which means lower taxes on corporate profits, lesser regulatory burdens, protecting the health of communities and the environment. And that, again, is one way to fragilize people and to create insecurity about the future. We've been pursuing growth by trying to reduce public deficits, cutting down on social expenses in order to nudge people into work, but that has been detrimental for many people in poverty that depend on social protection for their livelihoods. And so all these policies were pursued in the name of stimulating growth, but have created lots of anxiety, lots of economic insecurity, and have magnified inequalities in many countries.
One of the dynamics that you speak of, which I find interesting, is that you said that production in this world where we prioritize economic growth often serves the consumption needs of the rich than the basic needs of people living in poverty. Can you tell us a little bit more about this dynamic at play and perhaps if you have an example of how this works?
Well, indeed, one economist whom I admire very much, Tibor Skitowski, was fond of saying that the market is really a plutocracy. And by this, he meant that in a market society, most goods and services are produced in order to respond to the demand of those whose purchasing power is sufficient to command a control of the resources. When goods and services are produced following the market signals, the demand expressed by people who have the ability to put money on the table in this huge auctioning process that ultimately the market consists in. You will produce, for example, large mansions with swimming pools rather than invest in social housing. You will train as a doctor to for aesthetic surgery rather than serve the needs of poor communities in healthcare centers. And in general, the whole productive system um, will be geared towards meeting the demands or the demand expressed by the richer parts of the population rather than serving the basic needs of people in poverty. And that is a major problem. It leads to this paradox that as a result of society being highly unequal with many important gaps between the rich and the poor, the economy will be less efficient in delivering what people really need for flourishing and for well-being.
I think this paradox that you speak of is something that I witness every day around me. I'm in India at the moment, and I definitely see the stark duality where we have new high rises coming up around us every single day, while economic disparity is one of the highest it's ever been recorded. And really, for all of these claims of India being a rising superpower, a third of Indian children under the age of 3 today currently suffer from stunting, very much speaking to this dynamic that you just outlined. And so I want to ask you, what does it mean for us to move to a post-growth society? What are some concrete policies that could be put in place, and what would this world look like?
Well, this is a huge challenge, Prachi. And as I see things, we have been alerted by scientists working on the planetary boundaries since 60 years that infinite growth was not possible. One of the major episodes there was the publication in 1972 of the report by MIT scientists led by Donella and Dennis Meadows, who published The Limits of Growth, a report commissioned by the Club of Rome in 1972. And they were already alerting us to the fact that we were racing towards a cliff. They were actually predicting um, the, mm, the breakdown of the Earth system around 2030 as a result of us extracting resources from the ecosystems and dumping waste and pollution in the ecosystems that the ecosystems are unable to absorb. And the scientists are warning us that we cannot continue to grow. The metabolism of the economy, the consumption of energy and materials cannot continue indefinitely. Um, Economists are trying to draw the conclusions from this or draw the consequences from this by um, presenting macroeconomic models that can depend less on growth, on increased GDP, but they're struggling to provide convincing alternatives to our growth-obsessed development model. And politicians remain largely stuck in a 20th century mentality in which they see growth as a precondition for addressing all societal challenges. And in that regard, I have to say that the differences between the left and the right of the political spectrum um, are maybe to be put in perspective. They have, of course, different recipes as to how to create growth, with the Keynesian recipes on the left, based on increasing wages and providing strong social protection to ensure the middle class will be able to continue to consume in times of crisis. And on the right, um, uh, maintaining public deficits under control, having fiscally sustainable policies and creating a business-friendly investment climate. But ultimately, the right and the left depend on growth to ensure that governments can deliver for the population. And there is no real uh, reflection today as to how to continue to provide well-being, indeed to improve well-being without growth. And so this is why we are launching this major project, which is to identify how economies can be reformed in order to deliver well-being without needing to increase the GDP, without requiring economic growth to continue indefinitely. What we are doing is bringing together a large number of policy proposals that can improve well-being and contribute to the reduction of poverty and inequalities without requiring that the economy grows. And we are trying to see the links between these different policies, how they can be mutually supportive, how they can be inspiring the action of governments at different levels, from the local to the national to the international levels of governance, and how they can be sequenced from the short term to the long term in order to identify not only the bold vision that we have for a post-growth future, but also what are the steps that will take us there. That effort, if you wish, is less about architecture than it is about music. It's about identifying the steps that will allow us to move beyond growth as a recipe for development that supports well-being. And it's not only about a utopian vision that is now developed in academic think tanks, NGOs, and unions. So that is the effort we are now pursuing.
I really appreciate this work that you're doing in bridging many of these theoretical conversations, like you said, to real concrete policy proposals and strategies that can be pursued. So can you tell us a little bit more about what these strategies are? And can you give us a flavor of the kinds of policies that you're looking at? And perhaps also tell us a little bit about how you're putting these policies together.
Indeed, what is really striking, and I have to say, Prachi, extremely encouraging, is how many people are contributing to this collective effort which we are launching. Many within UN agencies are collaborating in this effort, from agencies such as the ILO, the International Labour Organization, UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNDP, the Development Programme, or FAO, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, are now thinking together about how to create the conditions for post-growth development. And of course, that effort fits also with the efforts of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for a human rights economy, and with the efforts of many NGOs, social movements, unions, and academic think tanks that are pursuing the same objective. And so what our effort consists in is to bring together all these actors, identify what their key proposals are that they wish to put forward, and we try to arrange these different policy proposals so that they are seen as mutually supportive and as complementary. Essentially, we are classifying these different policy proposals into 5+1 pillars. We have 5 substantive pillars that relate respectively to social protection and the provision of public services, number 1, to the world of work and the care economy, number 2, to the design of new economic models and business models, number 3, to how resources are managed and how we combat climate change and the environmental crisis, number 4, and 5th, how we rearrange international economic relations in order to address the crucial questions of debt, of the organization of trade, and how essentially we ensure that low-income countries can continue to develop in a post-growth context. And so these 5 pillars are complemented by a 6th pillar, if you wish, which is the roof of what we are trying to do, which relates to governance. Our political systems and our governance tools are equipped to do 2 things: to manage the status quo on the one hand, and to react to crisis on the other hand. But there is little in the governance systems we have to allow us to plan a transition through multi-year action plans that can ensure that we move away from the current path dependencies in which we are trapped. So what we need are indicators of progress, independent monitoring of progress, uh, participatory tools ensuring that governments do not act based on technocratic considerations alone, but that the knowledge of people in poverty and those on the front line of social struggles is valued and built upon. And all this governance should be rethought in order to effectuate this transition. So that is the effort. It consists in broadening the political imagination of governments, in expanding the policy toolbox on which they rely, because today they still are entirely dependent on their ability to grow the economy as if that were the condition sine qua non for achieving all the other objectives they set for themselves.
I think this is just a really phenomenal endeavor. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing in bringing together, it seems like, a wide variety of stakeholders in thinking about widening the political imaginations of governments. I think one thing I note here is that, and you said this earlier, which is that politicians continue to rely on this idea that economic growth is required for any kind of redistribution. What you note here, even in these policy proposals and pillars that you mentioned, for instance, around care work, around provision of social security, and the creation of public goods, is that these will require vast investments. And the question is, how will these investments be made without being financed through economic growth? And I ask this question to try to think about how we can make this project more amenable to governments and politicians.
Well, I think what's first important to note is that not all policy proposals can be implemented all at once. Many will require years of transition. To take one example in the world of work, you may immediately try to better value work that is socially useful and address the question of the fair remuneration, if you wish, in particular to encourage the care work and to value it much better. You can, in the course of a few years, perhaps establish a job guarantee, ensuring that people who are long-term unemployed will be able to be provided with a socially useful job financed by the public purse. And then in the long run, you may detach income from work by establishing, for example, an unconditional basic income system providing a guaranteed income to all people, whether or not they are working. And these different reforms may seem contradictory, but in fact they can be seen as complementary in a pathway approach in which you see the valuing of care work, the job guarantee as initial steps towards a society that ultimately should be less work-centered and should value what we do and what people achieve without having a paid job being a precondition for having a social status. But I close this parenthesis. I think what is really indeed at the heart of the challenge of thinking a post-growth world is how to finance the services that the state provides to its population. That is a major issue. And until now, it is true that governments have been hostage to corporations and to market actors, largely because governments depended on economic growth in order to finance the public services and social protection. So we needed growth in order to finance those services and to also reimburse the foreign debt, which I think is another major stumbling block in our thinking about post-growth. And so we need new financing tools. We need to increase tax on wealth rather than just income. We need to tax inheritance. We need to tax the ills of the economy, the extraction of fossil fuels, financial transactions, aviation and maritime transport, for example. There are many tools that until now have been underexplored, underused, and could allow to mobilize resources in order to continue to invest in the people and allowing the state to reduce its dependency on economic growth while still providing a very high level of protection to the population, which is absolutely key. You need more economic security rather than less in order to reassure people that a post-growth future is in their interest, can allow for lives that are more balanced, that will allow people to flourish, that will ensure well-being, um, and to dispel the anxiety that the idea that we can do without growth may otherwise cause.
On this question of economic security, I think one of the things that folks have argued is that economic growth is still crucial for many low-income countries that were stripped of their resources through histories of colonization and enslavement and don't have the same levels of wealth that countries in the global north do to finance. And also, despite having gained formal independence, many of these countries still remain locked into exploitative and neo-colonial relationships in the international order that undermine their interests. And so not only do these global south nations like India, Sri Lanka, and Mexico have ahead of them a much harder task of building their societies, given the extreme levels of deprivation within them, but also economic growth is argued to be a way for these nations to gain economic sovereignty. Can you talk to us about your analysis of the international order today?
This, I think, is a crucial part of the collective effort we are pursuing. Absolutely, low-income countries that still need to build communication infrastructures, schools, hospitals, to train teachers and so on, they need to grow and to increase the volume of revenue they can mobilize for their development. That's absolutely clear. And it's equally clear that the post-growth approach we are exploring will not provide a blueprint applicable to all countries, and the recipes should be different from context to context. What we try to do is expand the policy toolbox, but that doesn't mean that the same recipes will work for all. What we have today, however, is a growth-driven development that is extractive and exploitative. It is premised on the plundering of the resources of the global south to fuel the continued growth of countries in the global north. It is premised on the development of global value chains that thrive on the exploitation of low-paid workforce in the global south, that are sometimes especially attractive to multinational enterprises because they can pay low wages in the labor-intensive segments of the production chain, leading those countries in turn where workers are paid low wages to believe that their comparative advantage lies in keeping the population in poverty, which is an absolute impasse. And so we need to rethink those relationships and to provide low-income countries with opportunities to thrive, to develop, to grow, without that development having to be export-led and without it having to be based on the continued growth in the already obese economies of the global north. That means stimulating South-South trade. That means stimulating a type of development in the South that is driven more by the increase of domestic demand, which means investing in social protection in developing countries and financing that social protection. That means rethinking global value chains so that they do not lead to these extractive and exploitative practices that I've mentioned. Ultimately, the post-growth project we are leading is a decolonial project. It's a way to move away from relationships between the global north and the global south that are the legacy of the colonial period. Let me add, however, this, which is that one major reason why low-income countries cannot do more is because they face a very high debt burden. And in many low-income countries, more money is spent on servicing the debt than they spend on um, education or healthcare. And social protection, of course, in these countries is unaffordable, given in particular the level of debt service that they are being subjected to. So tackling this issue of debt, providing those countries with a way out by debt forgiveness and debt restructuring, and providing those countries with the kind of predictable support they need to invest in their people is the only way to allow them to escape this stranglehold. And this is why, with others, we have proposed a new financing mechanism, which we call the Global Fund for Social Protection, which essentially would be a window that low-income countries could knock at in order to obtain support for investing in social protection against the commitment to implement a multi-year action plan to build the capacity to expand social protection and make it universal within those countries, and to mobilize domestic resources gradually over the years in order to reduce the dependency on foreign aid. And that idea of a financing tool that would provide a very strong incentive for low-income countries to invest in social protection is one that I believe should be part of the solutions for the future.
So to switch gears a little bit here, and I want to go back to what you said about the workforce and specifically how there are exploitative labor conditions in countries in the global south that make it difficult for people to escape poverty. One interesting thing that comes to mind is that earlier this year, Narayan Murthy, who is the CEO of Infosys, which is a large Indian multinational corporation, dominated the news cycle here in India for a little while when he advocated for 14-hour workdays. As you might know, India is one of the most overworked countries in the world, but the conventional wisdom here that Narayan Murthy articulated, and is often presented as the realist version, is that hard work is essential for India's progress, and hard work is essential for people to escape the conditions of poverty that they find themselves in. So I wanted to ask you, what is your view on this, and how would the world of work look like in a post-growth society?
Well, in a post-growth world, the compass should be the well-being of people, the ability for humans to flourish, not simply the wealth that we manage to create and to accumulate. Um, Providing all workers with a living wage, allowing them to support themselves and their families without having to work 14 hours per day is, of course, a prerequisite for this. And so protecting workers' rights, including the right to a living wage, is part of what we need to pursue as a matter of priority to move to this new compass, if you wish. In a post-growth world, um, work, of course, will still have an important role to play, but there would be major changes in how it is organized. First of all, um, work that is socially useful, that of teachers, that of doctors, that of nurses, that of social workers, would be much better rewarded and valued than work the social utility of which is negative, such as that of private traders, speculators, or those working in the advertising industry. Today, the highest wages are for those jobs that, in fact, are socially toxic rather than providing positive externalities to society. So we should mend that.
Conversations often about poverty and the economy seem not to attend to questions around racial justice or building a feminist politics. It often seems like these conversations take place in different rooms. Can you tell us a little bit about how your work on Beyond Growth is attentive to the specific needs of racial and caste minorities and women and queer people? How do their specific needs feature in this agenda?
Well, growth is almost per definition extractive, right? In order to grow, um, uh, an economic actor, business enterprise, for example, must extract from people it puts to work, from the subsoils it exploits, um, more than it puts back in wages or in measures to replenish the environment, for example. So this extractive nature of growth as it has been pursued is what explains the subjugation of the part of the population that have been historically facing discrimination. The most easy to illustrate example is the work performed by mostly women in the reproductive economy, in other terms, within households, within communities, for maintaining the commons, for taking care of small children or older persons, for maintaining the way the community functions. All this work has been historically largely unrecognized, mostly non-remunerated, and women in all countries still today perform much more of that work in the reproductive part of the economy than men. And so that is the kind of exploitation that the post-growth future should address by different tools. We are exploring in our roadmap the possibility of introducing, for example, a universal care income, which would consist in essentially rewarding those, mostly women, who provide at yet unremunerated care work. We also believe that the reduction of working time could allow to arrive at a much more equitable distribution of reproductive work. And so these are the kind of measures that we believe should be pursued. But really we should realize that much of the exploitation and the discrimination that you referred to, that different groups within society are being subjected to, is the result of our apparently endless quest for growth and productivity increases.
So the roadmap, which consists of many of these proposals that you have just outlined right now, is, from what I understand, a next step in a process that you started last year, where you presented a report to the United Nations on eradicating poverty beyond growth. I want to ask you, what was the response in the room? Did member states engage with it? Is the UN listening?
Well, I was really impressed by the quality of the feedback received um, and the enthusiasm from many interlocutors who were presented with the report and reacted to it. Um, we launched, after the report was presented, a call for contributions to build this roadmap, and we received 161 answers from governments, including the EU, from UN agencies, from NGOs, academic think tanks, unions, which is really very impressive and leads us now to have to bring together all these policy proposals which have been proposed in answer to this call for contributions. So the response was extremely encouraging. And what was, for me, the most surprising and encouraging at the same time is that governments from the global south have reacted positively to the report Eradicating Poverty Beyond Growth presented in July 2024. And they reacted positively, I think, because they understand, as I said, that this is a decolonial project. It's a report that tries to show the need to provide much more support to developing countries to allow them to develop without having to depend on the growth in the global north, and that proposes to revisit the way international economic relations are organized to allow them to develop without depending on extracting the resources from their subsoils and exploiting the workforce within their jurisdictions. And I think they understand that there is now an opportunity to be seized. I'm not saying that it's an easy task to achieve. Particularly, the question of debt is a major lock-in the system that locks these countries into the quest for growth through exporting. Because of course, if you have a foreign debt labeled in dollars, you need to export to global markets whatever you can produce at home in order to have access to hard currencies with which you can service your debt. That's a major obstacle. But these countries understand at least that this is an impasse and that we need to find something else. So I was very encouraged by the responses received.
So Olivier, what comes next for you as you push this project forward? What are some of the next steps that we can expect to see from here on?
The roadmap for eradicating poverty beyond growth is being built. We hope to present this roadmap at a major event in Geneva in April 2026, bringing together all the major contributors to this collective effort. And the hope is to influence the next generation of development goals for the period 2030-2045, which is under negotiation within the United Nations. For the moment, within the UN, there is a major effort to rethink measures of progress based on the Pact for the Future adopted on 22nd of September 2024. An expert group has been established on measures of well-being beyond GDP. But the question of indicators is only one small part of a much broader effort to rethink the economy in order for it to serve the fight against poverty and the realization of human rights. So the hope is that we can present this project, the New Economies for Eradicating Poverty, NEP, as an alternative to the usual way of thinking about combating poverty through growth. And I very much hope that the alliances that have been formed in this process, the proposals, the policy proposals that have been put together and how they fit together, providing a coherent set of proposals for governments, will have an impact on how governments think about development in the future.
Olivier, thank you so much for putting all of this out here. My final question to you, really pulling from the last thing that you said, is what is giving you hope in this moment? What makes you feel like making this change is indeed possible?
There is enormous interest in expanding the policy toolbox that governments rely on to improve people's lives. And the idea that growth is not the solution and could even be, in some cases, the problem in the way we are pursuing growth is gaining ground today when it was a very fringe opinion even 10 or 15 years ago. So there's a huge interest, for example, in rethinking indicators of progress beyond GDP and to hold governments accountable based on other indicators, based on well-being rather than GDP growth. That is extremely promising. And it's also very promising that new alliances are being forged behind this project between development NGOs and environmental NGOs, public health specialists, and consumer rights advocates and human rights groups, and between academic think tanks and scientists working on planetary boundaries. And so all these alliances, which we are trying to encourage in the building of this roadmap, can make a difference and ultimately put pressure on governments for them to deliver something else.
Olivier, thank you so much for this conversation and for really laying out what's at stake when we talk about global justice and eradicating poverty. And to be honest, if there's one thing that this exchange makes clear to me, it's that building these economies that center care, like you said, and center dignity and ecological balance instead of status and extraction and profit is entirely within reach. And like you said, this work is already happening in unions and movements, in various alliances from academic think tanks and much more. And many of these alliances are also refusing to separate economic justice from climate justice or gender justice. And thank you so much for your work in bringing this to the United Nations and to member states. And as we mark the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, I think this conversation is a reminder to me that we must recognize that what we call the economy is a series of political choices. And the task before us is to build this countervailing power that is strong enough, like you said, to rewrite the rules of this economy and win the future that we all deserve. And as you've talked about today, that future is not only urgent, but it's also pragmatic and winnable. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Prachi, for your support.